Hello, guys. Ever been in a relationship where someone suddenly pulls away the moment things get emotionally intense? One moment you're connecting deeply, and the next, it's like they've disappeared behind an invisible wall. If you've found yourself confused, anxious, or even blaming yourself when this happens, you're not alone. Understanding avoidant behavior isn't just about decoding someone else. It's about protecting your own peace and knowing what you need to do in these moments. When someone with an avoidant attachment style shuts down emotionally, it's incredibly easy to take it personally, especially if you're someone who naturally leans in when things feel uncertain. The instinct is to think, "What did I do wrong?" You might replay conversations in your head, trying to pinpoint the moment things shifted. You might remember how present they were, how open they seemed, and how connected the two of you felt. And now that they're suddenly colder, more distant, less responsive, your mind scrambles for answers. This is what happens when you're trying to understand someone through the lens of your own emotional language. But avoidants don't operate in the same emotional landscape. See, when an avoidant shuts down, it's not usually a calculated move to hurt or reject you. It's a deeply ingrained defense mechanism. For someone with avoidant tendencies, closeness can feel threatening. The moment emotions become too intense, too vulnerable, or too unpredictable, they unconsciously retreat. It's not because you did something wrong. It's not because you aren't good enough. It's because emotional intimacy hits a part of them that feels unsafe, even if you've done everything right. But when you're on the receiving end of that emotional retreat, it doesn't feel like a pattern. It feels like abandonment. It feels like rejection. And that's what makes it so difficult. You personalize it. You start adjusting your behavior to prevent it from happening again. You hold back your own needs. You overthink your texts. You walk on eggshells just to avoid triggering that shutdown. And before you know it, you've made their emotional avoidance your responsibility. That's where things start to become really painful because you're slowly abandoning yourself just to stay connected to someone who doesn't know how to stay connected to you. The truth is, when someone emotionally detaches, it's a reflection of how they've learned to cope. Often, avoidant behavior stems from early experiences. Times when being vulnerable didn't feel safe, when opening up meant being let down, judged, or dismissed. They learned to be self-reliant, to withdraw instead of confront, to self-soothe instead of reach out. So when you come along and offer emotional depth, their first response isn't to embrace it, it's to resist it. Not because it's bad, but because it's unfamiliar. Now that doesn't mean they don't care. Avoidants can and do fall in love. They can feel deeply, but the moment they feel overwhelmed, they default to their safety zone, distance. So when you interpret that distance as a statement about your worth, you're missing the bigger picture. Their shutdown isn't an evaluation of you. It's a reaction to their own emotional discomfort. This is why it's so important to recognize that this behavior is not a direct reflection of your value, your effort, or your ability to be loved. The hard part is, we're often told that if someone pulls away, we just need to try harder, be more understanding, give them more love, be more patient. But this can actually reinforce a dynamic where you're giving more than you're receiving, where you're constantly managing someone else's emotional state instead of acknowledging your own. And that creates imbalance. When you constantly personalize their emotional shutdowns, you start to silence your needs. You start to feel like you're walking through a relationship on eggshells, always anticipating the next retreat. That's not connection, it's survival mode. Understanding that their behavior is a pattern doesn't mean excusing it. It just means seeing it clearly for what it is, so you can make better decisions. You stop asking questions like, "How do I get them to open up?" and start asking, "Is this behavior something I can live with long term?" You move from self-blame to self-awareness. And that shift is powerful. Because if every time they shut down, you assume the fault is yours, you'll keep shrinking in order to fit into a space they've emotionally abandoned. You'll start editing yourself. You'll start thinking that love is something you earn by being less needy, less expressive, less you. And that's the real danger. Not that they shut down, but that you start shutting down in response. When someone with avoidant tendencies begins to emotionally shut down, the first impulse for many people, especially those with more anxious or secure attachment styles, is to close the gap, You want to fix the sudden distance. You want to reconnect. You want to understand what went wrong. And more than anything, you want to restore the emotional intimacy that was there before. So you reach out, you double text, you ask if everything is okay, you replay your last interaction trying to decode the shift. This is a deeply human response, especially when you care. But with someone avoidant, this kind of pursuit often has the opposite effect. Avoidants tend to see closeness as overwhelming. When they emotionally shut down, they do it to regain a sense of control and safety. They're not just pulling back from you, they're retreating into themselves. And when they feel pursued during this retreat, even by someone with good intentions, it can trigger even more withdrawal. It's not that they want to push you away to hurt you. It's that they've learned to regulate their emotions through distance. So when they sense pressure, when someone comes too close emotionally, it feels like a threat, not a comfort. And what do we do when we feel threatened? We protect ourselves. For the avoidant, that often means going silent, becoming cold, distracted, or unavailable. Their nervous system is looking for space, not solutions. This is where it becomes crucial not to chase. And by chasing, that doesn't necessarily mean physically showing up at their door or bombarding them with messages. It can be far more subtle. It's the over-explaining, the pleading to be heard, the over-functioning in the relationship. It's adjusting your tone, your rhythm, your communication style in hopes that they'll respond better, open up, or come back to being present. These actions are all born from a deep desire to reconnect. But to someone avoidant, it can feel like pressure to emotionally engage when they're not ready to. What makes this dynamic so difficult is that the emotional shutdown of the avoidant creates a kind of vacuum. And if you're someone who needs reassurance or communication to feel secure, that vacuum becomes unbearable. So naturally, you try to fill it. You reach for them. You offer more understanding, more love, more patience. But what you're really doing, without realizing it, is taking on the work of the relationship all by yourself. You're bridging the entire gap. You're regulating both your emotions and theirs. And that imbalance, over time, wears you down. What often happens in these situations is a pattern where the more you pursue, the more they retreat. Then once you finally give up or pull back, they reappear. This gives the illusion that space is what makes them return. And in some ways, that's true, but not in the way most people think. Giving space isn't about playing games or reverse psychology. It's about disrupting the pattern that keeps you both stuck. If every time they shut down, you immediately try to draw them out, they never have to sit with the discomfort of disconnection. They never have to take responsibility for their emotional withdrawal. They know you'll always be the one to restore the connection, which means they don't have to. But when you stop chasing, when you step back, it changes the dynamic. It creates space not just for them to process, but for you to assess. It also helps clarify whether they're capable of showing up. When you give space, you're not punishing them. You're setting a boundary. You're saying, I won't keep pushing where there's resistance. I won't exhaust myself trying to connect with someone who isn't emotionally present. This kind of restraint takes strength, especially when every instinct is telling you to fix, explain, or close the distance. But it's this space that allows the avoidant to move toward you if they're capable. And if they're not, it helps you see that more clearly without getting caught in the exhausting loop of pursuit and retreat. The danger in constantly trying to bridge the emotional gap is that it creates an emotional dependency on their approval or response. You end up waiting for them to validate your effort. You measure the health of the relationship by whether they've finally opened up again, and slowly your emotional well-being starts revolving around how responsive they are. That's when self-neglect creeps in. You become so focused on keeping the connection alive that you lose touch with whether the connection is even meeting your emotional needs in the first place. When someone you care about begins to emotionally shut down, especially if they have avoidant tendencies, it's natural to want to reach out and reconnect. You might think the solution is to break through their walls, to show them more love, more care, more commitment, to reassure them that it's safe to come out of hiding emotionally. But here's the truth that's hard to accept. Emotional safety isn't something you can create for someone else by working harder or loving them more. It's something they have to choose to build with you. You can offer space, kindness, and openness. But if they're not willing to step into that space, no amount of effort from your side will change that. A common mistake people make in these situations is trying to fix the avoidance discomfort. You see them pulling away and immediately think, maybe if I just explain better, maybe if I'm more patient, maybe if I don't bring up anything too emotional, they'll stay. So you begin to shrink your own needs. You avoid talking about how you feel. You downplay your vulnerability in hopes that they'll feel more comfortable and less overwhelmed. It's a subtle form of self-abandonment that happens in the name of keeping the peace. But over time, this dynamic chips away at your sense of self. The moment you make it your job to manage someone else's emotional safety, you take on a responsibility that doesn't belong to you. Avoidant individuals often learned early on that emotional intimacy equals vulnerability, and vulnerability equals danger. So they built walls to protect themselves. But here's what's important to understand. Those walls are theirs. You didn't build them, you didn't cause them, and you can't tear them down for someone else. What you can do is create a space where safety is available, but whether or not they walk into that space is up to them. Trying to fix someone's emotional discomfort often comes from a good place. You see someone struggling to connect, and your heart says, if I can just love them better, they'll feel safe. But love doesn't work that way. Emotional safety is not about removing every possible trigger or becoming so easy to be around that they never feel the need to retreat. It's about having two people who are both willing to show up and be emotionally available. One person trying to carry that emotional labor for two doesn't lead to connection. It leads to resentment, burnout, and imbalance. You might find yourself excusing behaviors that make you uncomfortable because you believe they just need time or that they don't know how to be close. So you wait. You tolerate inconsistency. You absorb their silence, their withdrawal, their avoidance, and tell yourself this is what love looks like when someone is scared. But love without accountability isn't love. It's a performance where one person does all the work. When you're constantly trying to be the emotional anchor for someone who won't even dip their toe into the waters of vulnerability, you're not in a relationship. You're in a role. Protecting your emotional safety means being honest about what you need. It means saying, this distance hurts me, instead of pretending it doesn't. It means not tiptoeing around someone's fears while ignoring your own. When you focus on creating emotional safety for yourself, it changes everything. You stop trying to be the right person for them and start asking, is this the right person for me? You stop managing their emotional world and start tending to your own. You recognize that someone pulling away may not be a signal to try harder. It might be a signal to step back and check in with yourself. It's not about blaming the avoidant partner. Avoidant behaviors often come from deep emotional wounds, and they deserve compassion. But compassion doesn't mean sacrificing your own emotional needs. You can understand where someone is coming from without excusing how it affects you. You can acknowledge their pain without ignoring your own. And most importantly, you can stop trying to fix them and instead start asking whether this relationship is meeting the standard of emotional health you want for your life. When you focus on emotional safety, you're not trying to force someone into connection. You're creating a relationship environment where connection can grow, if both people are willing. It's not about pushing them to open up. It's about setting a tone of honesty, clarity, and presence, and observing whether they meet you there. If they don't, it's not your job to drag them. It's your job to notice what that tells you about the emotional availability in the relationship. When someone shuts down emotionally, especially if they have an avoidant attachment style, your instinct might be to try harder to connect with them. You may think that if you just find the right words, soften your tone, or show them how patient and loving you can be, they'll finally feel safe enough to let their guard down. But what often happens in this process is that you end up communicating without boundaries. You find yourself trying to draw them out instead of expressing where you stand. And while you may be saying all the right things on the surface, being calm, being open, being understanding, if you're not clear about your own limits and emotional needs, you can easily fall into a dynamic where their emotional detachment sets the tone for the entire relationship. Avoidant individuals often don't respond well to emotional pressure, even when that pressure is subtle. That's why it's so important to communicate not only with calmness, but also with clarity. And clarity means boundaries, not threats, not ultimatums, but honest, self-respecting limits around what you can and can't accept in a relationship. A boundary might sound like expressing that you value emotional connection and want a partner who's willing to share, not just disappear when things get hard. It might be calmly stating that you're not okay with prolonged silence or coldness when conflict arises, not because you're trying to control their behavior, but because you know what you need to feel safe and fulfilled. Often, people think setting a boundary is the same as causing conflict, but in reality, boundaries are what prevent long-term resentment and disconnection. When you're not clear about your emotional limits, you might hold back your truth for fear of scaring them off. You might not speak up when something hurts because you don't want to be seen as dramatic or too much. You might tolerate emotional distance, hoping it's just temporary. But every time you stay silent to keep the peace, you trade a small piece of your self-respect for temporary harmony. And over time, that harmony starts to feel hollow. When you communicate with calm, clear boundaries, you shift the dynamic. You stop chasing reassurance and start offering truth. You say what you feel, what you need, and what you can't continue to tolerate. Not to control them, but to honor yourself. You're not demanding emotional availability from someone who isn't capable. You're simply saying, "This is what I need in a relationship. If that's something you can't or won't give, I respect that, but I can't stay in a space that doesn't meet that standard." This kind of communication is powerful because it's not reactive. It's not emotionally loaded or full of blame. It's steady, grounded, and honest. And that's exactly what avoidant individuals are often most responsive to. Not heightened emotion, not pressure, not persuasion, but a calm presence that knows its own value. When you communicate from that place, you create a mirror. You show them what healthy emotional responsibility looks like. You model maturity. You express vulnerability with strength. And in doing so, you make it clear that emotional connection in this relationship is not a one-sided task. It's a shared responsibility. What this also does is give you a clear framework for evaluating the relationship. When you communicate your boundary calmly and clearly, their response tells you everything. Do they shut down further? Do they listen but make no effort to change? Do they dismiss your needs as too much? Or do they take it in, reflect, and try to meet you with openness, even if imperfectly? Their reaction doesn't just reveal where they are emotionally, it reveals whether they're actually interested in building a deeper connection or just maintaining the status quo. But none of this can happen if your communication is focused solely on how to keep the relationship alive. That's what many people fall into. Conversations centered around fixing, saving, or holding things together, instead of expressing, discerning, and choosing. When your communication is rooted in fear of losing the person, you'll often say what you think they want to hear, or withhold what needs to be said. But when your communication is rooted in clarity and calm self-respect, you stop fearing loss and start focusing on alignment. And alignment matters more than temporary peace. When someone shuts down emotionally, your role isn't to tiptoe around their discomfort. Your role is to stay anchored in your truth and express it with maturity. That means speaking your needs without dramatics, naming your boundaries without threats, and refusing to negotiate your emotional health just to keep someone close. It means staying emotionally present without sacrificing your own sense of self. It means not getting pulled into the emotional chaos of another person's avoidance pattern, but instead staying steady in your own emotional integrity. When you're in a relationship with someone who shuts down emotionally, it can feel like walking through a fog. One moment there's warmth, connection, and even vulnerability. The next, it's like you're speaking into silence. Their walls go up, their words become few, and their presence starts to feel like absence. And if you're emotionally invested, this shift can be jarring. You may start to doubt your own perception. You question whether things were ever real, whether their silence is a punishment, or whether they're slowly pulling away without telling you. It's in these moments that your sense of emotional reality begins to blur. This is why it's so important not just to respond to them, but to come back to you. When someone emotionally withdraws, especially repeatedly, it can create a kind of emotional destabilization in the relationship. You begin adapting to the uncertainty. You lower your expectations. You start telling yourself things like, Maybe this is just how they deal with stress. Maybe they just need more space than most people. Maybe I'm being too sensitive for needing communication and reassurance. The longer you stay in this dynamic without checking in with your own emotional center, the easier it becomes to lose sight of what you actually want from a relationship. You start to normalize emotional inconsistency. You begin to equate connection with effort and overfunctioning. You believe that love means constantly navigating someone else's fear of intimacy, and that if you're just patient enough, calm enough, loving enough, they'll eventually feel safe and stay close. But every time you abandon your emotional truth to stay in the relationship, you teach yourself that your needs are negotiable, that your longing for emotional consistency is an inconvenience, that your voice is only worth using when it doesn't upset the other person. And that's when the real damage begins. Not because someone shut down, but because you began silencing yourself in response. Emotional shutdowns happen. People have moments of overwhelm. Everyone has emotional wounds and ways they cope. But patterns are different. When someone consistently withdraws in the face of emotional intimacy and that pattern goes unchecked, it becomes the emotional rhythm of the relationship. You start learning when to speak and when not to. You start sensing their moods and adjusting your behavior accordingly. You become emotionally hypervigilant, always scanning for signs of distance so you can fix it before it grows. And while that may look like devotion on the surface, what it often is underneath is survival mode. Your nervous system trying to maintain a connection that feels unpredictable. This is why grounding yourself in your own emotional reality is non-negotiable. You need to know what you feel, what you need, and what's true for you, even when someone else is pulling away. That means asking yourself hard questions. Am I constantly managing the emotional atmosphere of this relationship? Am I holding back my truth in hopes they'll feel safe enough to stay? Am I losing my emotional clarity because I've become too focused on theirs? Coming back to yourself is not about disconnecting or giving up. It's about remembering that your emotional experience matters just as much as theirs. You can hold compassion for their struggle without diminishing your own. You can understand their fears without sacrificing your needs, and you can stay connected to your heart while refusing to lose yourself in the process of trying to hold someone else's together. One of the most important things you can do when someone shuts down emotionally is to ask, what's true for me right now? Not what do they feel, what do they want, or how can I make them open up, but what am I feeling? What am I carrying? What do I need that I'm not getting? These questions ground you. They pull your attention away from the emotional vacuum created by their distance and bring you back into your own body, your own truth, your own emotional anchor. Relationships built on uneven emotional labor don't just create tension, they slowly erode your confidence. You start doubting your instincts. You stop trusting your emotional signals. But when you stay connected to yourself, when you practice emotional self-honesty, you begin to recognize the difference between someone needing time and someone creating patterns of disconnection. You begin to discern between occasional distance and consistent unavailability. And most importantly, you begin to trust that you don't have to lose yourself to keep someone else. Coming back to yourself is an act of emotional strength. It's choosing to stay grounded even when someone else is floating in and out of emotional presence. It's choosing to name your needs even when they don't. It's recognizing that your emotional clarity is your greatest source of power in a relationship. And it's that clarity that ultimately gives you the ability to choose connection without confusion, love without self-abandonment, and relationship without emotional imbalance.